First of all, one should start with a very important point that we're not talking here about traditions in a kind of rigid sectarian way that we're kind of familiar with from the West. There's a great deal of kind of interpenetration, of kind of mutual kind of give and take between the traditions. And that means really in Tibetan Buddhism nobody is wholly one tradition alone. There's been such a kind of mix of teachings, and the basic values are all the same anyway. But having said that, we can distinguish them, I think, pretty much like this. That the earliest of the traditions of Buddhism in Tibet, we call it Nyingma, or ancient, they still exist, and they've been perhaps a tradition that, while being philosophically very profound, have also had the kind of greatest kind of rapport with kind of ordinary folk traditions of religion in Tibet. So you find everything in the Nyingma tradition, from great yogins, great scholars, to kind of village priests essentially, who are kind of looking after the local village's needs. And at the other end, perhaps of this kind of spectrum, you've got the Gelug tradition, which in the 17th century became essentially ruling church of Tibet through the fifth Dalai Lama. They're, if you like, the most monastic. Gelug Lamas are almost, well, they should be all monks, and nowadays perhaps one or two are not, but the Gelug is the most scholarly and the most monastic. And then in the middle you've got the Sakya and Kagyu traditions, the ones I've really been trained in. They are traditions that started out in the 11th century as traditions that grew out of contact with great Indian masters, and originally they were both traditions led by married yogins, by people who were not monastic, but although they trained properly, they tended to carry on. They were carrying on the teachings and traditions as lay people. They quickly became monasticized to a great extent, but they're still not wholly monastic. And so the Sakya and Kagyu traditions are, if you like, traditions that are very serious, but have this great flexibility. And similarly, they both have great scholars and great meditators. So I put the Sakya and Kagyu in that kind of way as being the ones who, as it were, represent the widest kind of breadth of Tibetan Buddhism. I think really usually it chooses you because you have an affinity with it, or maybe you just have affinity with certain masters. Because after all, again, we're not talking about rigid institutions and churches like, I'm going to go out and bubble on and join this church. Really it kind of happens organically, although I think that's probably the result of our past karma that gives us that particular affinities. You meet different teachers and you feel a rapport with them, and that's the way it works. It's like this. From the kind of working relationship you have with a particular teacher or teachers, you kind of find yourself within a tradition. I think it happens that way. I mean, people could nowadays go out and kind of shop for a tradition, shop for a school, but I feel that was a little bit kind of too conceptual, too kind of a little bit artificial, if you know what I mean.